So welcome to our next talk, and this next talk is titled Information Security Assurance, the capital C in PDCA by Frank Ackermann. Frank works for the German Stock Exchange and has a long-standing experience in cybersecurity. For him, cybersecurity is not just a job, cybersecurity is his passion. Frank, please.
And everybody, and I'm really sorry that the current corona situation wasn't best, so I wasn't able to travel, but at least we have the possibility that I can have the presentation right here. I thank for your interest, and I also thank the DeepSec team that I can take this talk to a wider audience. As I was introduced, I'm working for Deutsche Börse since some time, and I actually have a long history in information security since, 2000. And I worked in different functions in the first, second, and third line. And actually, this talk is also a kind of a journey into what I've experienced and what the outcome is to make assurance really happen, to work and implement security right. When you think about Deutsche Börse is actually a stock exchange market. And one thing up front, whenever you're in Frankfurt, take your time and go to the capital city, directly into the city, close to Konstablerwache. There's this old stock market, and the old stock market is really busy, so still busy. There's also where the news are coming from, the reporting from the stock exchange, and there was a new museum installed there, and it's opening soon, especially after Corona or in between the time. And it's a really nice museum, understanding how trade exchange works and what actually is behind bull and beer. You're not going to get hundreds of company slides up front the talk, but I wanted to pick actually the word trust, because trading, market, finance is always about trust. And this is what I wanted to actually pick up, because it's about trust in the sustainable economies. And it's also trust for information security, because information is one key thing which is going through all our processes, going in all our functions, and why this actually this topic, verifying the implementation, is quite important. I would like to briefly walk through the life cycle of trading. It's pre-trading, trading and clearance, and post-trading, in case you're not familiar with all the financial tasks. And the major thing here, and that's actually, it's about in the next step, it's information technology is the key. It's actually the focus and core of pre-trading, trading, clearing, and post-trading, because it relies on not changed and really good functional interactions of the system. So reliability, sustainability, availability, but also integrity and confidentiality. And you see here, it's all the buzzwords we know. It's all the things we actually agreed and work for to make security happen. And when the data, which is the underlying for processing the trades or kind of using methods to analyze if a trade is going up or down in future, when, for example, the underlying data is altered, changed, or misused, the complete trade market will fall or will be untrusted. And that would be one thing which affects us a lot. And this is why I say IT or information security or information technology, including security, is a key for our business, for the company, but also helps a lot for make it sustainable, make it work. When I joined Deutsche Börse in August 2020, it actually it hit me a bit like, okay, you can actually take over the topic IS assurance. And I was kind of, well, what is the IS assurance? What is actually the thing behind it? And it first popped into my head like, okay, it's like audit, it's like the third line of defense, it's a verification of what's been implemented, how does it work, what is actually really done. And the more I went, or the more I moved into leading this topic, thinking about how our company is working, the more I came to the point, continuous improvement is actually one of my drivers. And I was really thinking about, okay, how could I combine this task, developing the function IS assurance, and also gluing this continuous improvement into that. And I will come to continuous improvement in the later slides, because it's actually combining several ideas into one to make it really happen. To understand where we are, and also to understand why I was thinking about what IS assurance is, I would like to give a brief wrap up of what our current second line is looking like. So we have information security framework and governance, which is actually the second line in Deutsche Börse Group. And we have three main functions. One is information security risk, like classic threat landscape, information security risk management, and so on. We have security governance. It's like managing, developing, continuous improvement of the framework, like the policies and standards, but also security and staff awareness, or kind of tryouts on employees if it's working, if security awareness is working, or exchange with HR to think about what the next measures or ideas is to develop individually or individual the complete stuff in direction of information security. And by the way, I had a very nice talk yesterday about insider threats. Highly recommended to look it back in Vimeo if you have the possibility. And the last is actually building up and thinking about IS assurance. And the main task and the main idea is, or was in that time, verifying the design operational effectiveness and the implemented controls, which means the idea, and this is also mentioned in our standards and policies, is to have a function verifying how our controls are ongoing and implemented in the first line and in the organization. And as I said earlier, it's about what is really IS assurance. Is it really verifying like audit style to think about how is it implemented? How is it really working? Deep dive in it and try to find anything which is odd? Or is it like to evaluate something and see and report on how good we are? Is it really working? And that's one of the issues what most of the security organizations lack on, in my opinion, is we are good in, on the one side, describing no-goes or policies which forbid certain things. But we mostly have not the possibility or the ability to describe how good we are, or how good this, for example, policy really works. And when you also see, for example, that mostly internal or external audit swings by, verifies and assesses certain things and comes to a point, they're reporting based on risks, but they're not reporting based on effectiveness. So is it really working? And another thing which is also quite interesting is when internal audit or external audit is verifying a situation, they might come up with quite good ideas, but they will also challenge if the, for example, policy or standard is implemented like it was written in the policy and standard. But what about time changes and you weren't able to change the policy or the control requirement? So then internal audit checks on an, for example, nonsense or an not perfectly articulated requirement and finds it not well, describes the finding, even though you should actually change your framework and your standard. And these were all the influences I was thinking about, how to continue in future and what are actually our influencers on developing this function. In the financial world, there are quite some, let's say, next to the regulators or the regulated environments, we have also a lot of standards where a lot of people refer to, or frameworks where people refer to. When you, for example, think about what EBA is doing, like in the financial industry, or actually doing control verifications, they pick samples, they run tests, they do interviews, and then kind of identify the deviations and describe it. So it's a little bit like audit style. On the other side, there is this maturity level thing, like how good we are currently, how far we would like to develop. And this is, for example, CMMI, you might know that, or COSO for risk. And in the most cases, it's a self-assessment, or just having a big questionnaire, mostly self-assessment, or sometimes also in based of an interview or with a workshop. And then you come to a description of how good or what should be done to go in a certain direction to develop. And the idea what I had is to bring both worlds together, not only to verify individual specific requirements, but really think about the next development step, thinking about the maturity, where we are and where we would like to be, and thinking about how could this be done as an, let's say, more like a verification done by our function, like IS assurance itself, not to overcome or to occupy the stakeholders, or in that case, the interested parties itself. For example, when you would like to deep dive into, let's say, network security, it should not be the task of the guys and experts from network security to provide all this stuff. It's more like that they should be limitedly involved in that, but you do the assessment, you do the analysis. And that's also what I meant here with do not perform audit style interviews or to run self-assessment questionnaires. It's about not occupying the company or the individual functions, but on the other side, to assess and to process a lot of information out of the organization, to state mostly independent where we are, and also to give a signal into when we know where we are, we can also say in which direction we would like to go. What we developed, and this is what I've developed in 2 steps. We firstly described a general framework, what IS assurance is, what the functions, how the function could be implemented. And the second is we understood that certain criteria were not fully described, so we enhanced our development. And this is how I also came into this middle circle statements, like we want to assess it, but we also want to meter it. And meter it is actually, in the most cases, it's qualitative. So we say, well, it's good or not so good. Or we have a very kind of slow range or categories where, for example, it says it's yellow, it's green, or it's red. What I wanted to do is to find a way to meter it in a way that we can signalize, oh, it's in that range, like we are 90%, for example, effective, or we are 40% effective. The assessment should be sample-based. So we have, in that case, we need our experts. We have to draw samples or ideas to think about, is it really working? Do we meet our requirements? And the next step is also, we want to describe it. So what is actually the status quo? Do we meet our requirements? And this is actually going to another side loop of idea is, let's say we assess our own situation based on the requirements described in the standard. This means that we also verify if the requirements are good. And assume you have built your own information security framework, the policies, a couple of years ago. You revised it maybe once a year or so, but not in depth. You miss out certain requirements. You miss out policy requests which come from the older days. You have to think about the next step. How could we change the situation? How is it really a requirement we would like to have? For example, when you have perimeter security and a lot of perimeter security requirements, but no move into a cloud world, then this requirement should be altered, should be changed because it's not working. And that's also a thing I wanted to include in the methodology and in the ongoing type to develop. And in combination with, and that's the last point, being an advisor and a critical friend, to not being this top down, you have to do this, that's not good, you have to improve this. It's more about to think, okay, we from second line, we actually own the information security management system. We would like to make it happen and implement it, not in an ivory tower, but working. So we need to have details and understanding from a machine room. And that's the link I would like to give, and signalizing to the CISO, signalizing to security management, if it's working, effectively working, also to senior management, but also playing back these details and exchange to the machine room, like to operations. What does this requirement mean? Or if they have misinterpreted a certain requirement and build it up a new guideline, to change this and to move them and to support them in grow in their definitions of the guidelines. Speaking of guidelines, and that's actually quite typical pyramid, what you normally know. Normally, the information security frameworks are built up in a small charter, which is the general security, let's say, idea. Then you have policies and standards, where mostly the control objectives and requirements are. Then you have underlying documents like operational documents, handbooks, manuals. So it's more like how the design and the implementation is described. And then you have security processes. And all this becomes part of what IS assurance could verify depending on an individual scope. And the result is actually, and this is, I'm going to repeat myself here, is to describe on the one side the grading of effectiveness, but also describing the maturity if business wants to have this. When you remember this picture from the bull and the bear, like IS assurance and improvement, I also came or stumbled across again over ITIL. And this is what you might know: strategy, design, transition, operation, improvement is actually one part of a typical service. And I also see IS assurance as a service. And that's actually the life cycle, how I display this in our organization, but also how IS assurance actually lived. So we need to firstly think about what is the core of our work. It's actually our rule set, our frameworks, the policies. And based on this, and for example, also other influencers like audit findings or certain interests or an incident, there could be coming out a strategy. And this strategy means we're planning the topics. And the objectives or the objects around or the deliverables are actually also points which are quite similar to what normally audit does. So audit does, for example, in annual planning. The next thing is we need to design actually how we are doing the assessment, how we do the control verification. And that's something we describe as an assessment program. When I mentioned, for example, network security, there could be an assessment topic called network security. Everything relied and linked to network security out of our policy could be part of that, part of this requirements. Compared to the audit language, this would be actually the audit program or audit audit plan, depending on which language you're using. The transition is more like a word I use to have this ideal circle around. And but while developing the assessment program, one side deliverable is that we have also our template for the testing documentation. So when we do the assessment, we also want to document how we are doing, what we are doing, and have this in case we were asked if we can prove that we performed the assessment and that we can prove that our criteria were not mixed up. So we can document it while we're doing the assessment. Performing the assessments operations is actually doing the assessment, executing it, and this results in a documentation. Audit speaks about audit report, and this document actually delivers the insight about what is the situation, how we are, what is how effective we are, and in case business wants to have it, then we're speaking also about maturity levels. Lessons learned and KPI is another thing to really improve the situation. So there's a learning curve. The learning curve is number one for us, is the assessment program, which is for us currently every assessment we do, it's the first time we do it because the ICE assurance function wasn't existing before. And we have to learn if the assessment program was well defined, did work, or if we have to shape something, if something didn't work. The next thing we learn about is the framework, like the security rule set, is this working? Do we have the right policies and requirements described? Were there requirements which were correct and precise but not implemented? And then we can give also statements about, okay, this and this requirements weren't met. They weren't definitely not implemented, which means we could think about, is this requirement really correct? Or is it something that, for example, operations missed to implement this requirement? That's also part of the lessons learned and improvement. And the next is also, in case we find a test object or a focus area as good, we could also say, okay, this should not be part of the next annual plan. This could be, for example, performed in 1, 2, 3, 4 years later. And this also links a bit to what audit or internal audit normally uses. It's called a risk universe. They think about which processes, which objects combined with which risks needs to be verified more often compared to the assessment planning. When I speak about the results, we thought a lot, and this also was revised already. How would we like to grade and demonstrate the effectiveness? And this links, number one, to what the ECB, so the European Central Bank, says, but also and what the expectation of grading for Banque Centrale de Luxembourg is. And both are stakeholders of Deutsche Börse and also regulators of Deutsche Börse to signalize in which way the financial market also in Europe must go. And interestingly, ECB describes not only that there should be a grading and verification of effectiveness in this paper of cyber resilience oversight, but this expectation also says we have to think about maturity and build up a process for maturity modeling, maturity validation. And this kind of combines the ideas, what I earlier mentioned, to not only verify the status quo, but also think about the next step and the deliverable. The effectiveness grading is something we developed and also communicated quite early in the stage of the development to the stakeholders to make them aware that there is a grading. And the grading, that's, I'm coming to the calculation in the next steps. The grading is actually also a demonstration on how good we are or do we have an improvement. And this improvement can also can relate in potential findings. But the interesting point is to see also how strong or which kind of need do we have to improve. When, for example, an outcome is largely effective, then it could be, for example, that we have minor deviations or minor shortcomings in a certain area, but the rest is working. Or, for example, that we have seen the effectiveness in a quite good way, but one requirement is missed. But when we're talking about ineffective implementation, this could mean, for example, that certain requirements are not considered at all, not implemented, or the design is actually not implemented so far. The effectiveness meets maturity. That's actually the combination of both. So what we normally do, and that's simply to explain, an assessment might not be on one focus area, but on several. For example, when we, let's say, speak about software development or secure software development, there might be not the complete process chain evaluated of software development, but certain parts are quite interesting or should be more in focus. For example, when you say vulnerability scanning of source code is quite important, then this could be one inspection area or one focus area. Or when you say access control to the source code or to your GitHub is quite important, that could be another actually focus area of an assessment. each result of an assessment area or focus area results in a scoring. And this is what I meant here with this 5 light blue dots. It's we have 5 focus areas with a different result. And the mid result is actually what the outcome is here. So the outcome for the complete testing, like let's say secure software development, would be largely defective and is involved or pushed by, on the one side, quite positive results that we have areas of effective and largely effective, but also we have areas with improvement where it's partly effective or ineffective. This gives actually the indication of where we stand with the effectiveness. Interestingly, now it comes to the maturity. And maturity, as I mentioned earlier, one good framework is CMMI. CMMI is the maturity model of CMMI is that you describe on the one side the organizational, but also the process maturity. And these are 5 levels, like initial, managed, repeatable, defined, quantitatively managed, and optimized. And these 5 levels are described in several documents, and also the criteria are quite described in several documents. What we did here is we combined this diverse criteria and thought about what could be valuable for us as organization and pre-analyzed these requirements and build it up 8 categories for maturity. And when you look at the maturity and these categories like management sponsorship, policies and standards, control implementation, initiative for improvement, knowledge management, when you see this and when you could read, and that's in that case not disclosed, when you could read all the analyses, it will remind you a lot on 27,000, because 27,000 also requires certain aspects of this. When you look in 27,000 standard, management sponsorship is one key to implement information security correctly. And it's the same here. When you would like to implement a certain topic correctly, for example, good secure software development, then you need to have support. You need to have sponsorship by your management to, for example, implement it in depth, to also increase the maturity of this, for example, software development, and to push the organization to follow these steps. The same, another good criteria for becoming and grow in maturity could be, for example, knowledge management. Let's assume your organization is a mid-sized company and you have only 2 or 3 IT people who are supporting you in a process. Then you might have the problem that these persons have not the time to be well trained, or not well trained in every topic, or it's not possible to share this knowledge with a wider group so that they can back up themselves. And that could be also quite good criteria for knowledge management to grow in maturity. So for example, knowledge management criteria for initial is that everybody works in silos. So there is no information sharing and there is no knowledge sharing at all. But when you grow in your organization, grow in the process and share this information, so you're growing and you get better. And meaning here, for example, you have defined trainings, you have defined a defined setup to share this knowledge. You have, for example, also a role description to say that and that role needs to have that and that education. Otherwise, you're not mature to actually move this. And when you, for example, take specific or really interesting, spicy topics like SIEM and SOC, you cannot let everybody work in SIEM and SOC. You have to have certain capabilities. You have to have a certain mindset. The people are well trained. Mostly they're senior experts, in-depth knowledge about security, vulnerability, incident management. And this is actually where maturity of the organization and processes and also knowledge is quite needed to have this organization ready. We do our assessments based on the criteria here defined in these categories, and then come to a result. Like say, we identify that you could be or you are in the middle right of 2.5 or 2.6, but you want to actually be your maturity or aspired maturity level is 3, which means here we can give, and that's actually a nice side effect of running the assessments. smoothly and based on real facts, we can directly give recommendations how to improve, how to become and go in that direction of the maturity. And vice versa. Let's say we identify that we are over, let's say that some things are already quantitatively managed, we have good figures, KPIs are installed, a good reporting is in place, mostly, or some things are already automated, then we could also give recommendations to actually to optimize it, to think, to also to feedback. Here your organization is better than your aspired maturity level. You could think about reducing certain services or optimizing it, because this is also one thing which is an ongoing aspect in IT and information security since years, that IT and IT information security or information security is actually a cost factor and not a supporter of business. And and this kind of supports also this viewing on maturity, because when you say as a company and organization you would like to be in a certain maturity level, then you can say, okay, we need to spend money on this to become that maturity level, or vice versa. When you identify that your current situation is even better than the aspired level and aspired situation, then you can think about reducing certain services or functions. A nice thing, and that's also combined in what I mentioned with the EZB, the requirements on cybersecurity, is EZB talks about cyber resilience and the maturity level in there. And when you just make it a really simple formula, it's effectiveness and maturity together is actually cyber resilience. And that's something I haven't as a simple slide, just the 3 words, but that's actually it. When you have a good effectiveness and you can demonstrate also with testing that an implementation is effective, that you're meeting the requirements. And on the other side, you can demonstrate and verify how good your organization and the individual processes are. This gives a signal on your cyber resilience. And you can be sure when, for example, when you assess a topic which is not so greatly effective, for example, that certain requirements are not working, the requirements were not considered in the implementation is not so great. This means also that the maturity will not be great. You cannot be in a high state of maturity level, but really ineffective. And this goes quite well along. And this gives also a good way on demonstrating and showing how your cyber resilience or resilience can be. A question which I received a lot is, well, CMMI and all this maturity things, who does use it? And I've picked just a couple of examples. That's actually the new thing. So a couple of years ago, everybody was talking about cyber. I would say maturity is the new buzzword, because it's actually the way on moving the organization, pushing the organization forward. What I've experienced is that a lot of companies who are not pushed by law, by the regulators to do certain things in security, it's not happening. But what now happens is that a lot of not only regulators, but also, for example, big consultancy companies, what they're working on is to use the word maturity to push the organization to grow. And when you see here, that's one big company, they're also using CMMI and build up their own maturity level with their own criteria to have this maturity model and maturity level defined. Or it's about blockchain. Or when you see, for example, another big company using it for having a digital maturity model, which is also quite nice. What they're doing is actually they're translating CMMI or equivalent frameworks into a way to meter and assess how good the company is and how good actually the process and organization is, and demonstrate it for the next step to support them, to consult them moving forward. And that was actually the idea what we had and what I had in building up the function ICE assurance to combine this view, to test it, how good we are, and what needs to be done for the next step. There are many things where I had lessons learned on the development of the methodology, and there are also many lessons learned which I would like to share. And I just start. It's actually the first thing then act. It's a typical one. So most companies I've worked in, sometimes they picked up a topic and started implementation without actually thinking, and they do it on good on a they have real interest to push the topic, but sometimes it wasn't time enough to think about in which area would like to go. Or speaking about assurance, you want to do assurance. Oh yes, but is it audit? Is it a self-assessment? Is it an advisor? Or what the heck do you want to do? So I really recommend sit back and outline what you want. Discuss it with your primary stakeholder. What steps should you take, and what is actually the frame you would like to set for your assurance function? Because when you would like to go, for example, in an audit style, think about that you are on a turf of the second line, like internal audit or external audit. When you do running self-assessment, then you come quite close to, for example, other areas, for example, compliance, they do mostly, or ICS, they do mostly self-assessment. Do you would like to run on their turf? Or do you would like to be an inside advisor, but when you are only an advisor, how could you demonstrate that you do assessments, or actually that you can verify and document assessments and effectiveness correctly? The next step is when you develop your assessment and assessment methodology, when you thought about it, start describing it, speak about it clearly, understandable, as precise as possible. Make it mostly transparent, because that's actually what I've also learned, that you want to differ. If you want to differ and you would like to differentiate between, for example, your compliance functions, ICS functions, internal audit functions, whatever you have in your company, if you would like to differ, make it transparent why you differ and what makes your benefit and what is the benefit for the company, because this gives the best backup and, coming to that, the best buy-in. Get the buy-in is actually also something you need to have, because you might have a lot of stakeholders depending on the size of your organization, and you might have also a couple of, I call it critical friends, like people who would like to give thoughts and ideas into that, push you a bit, but not negatively. But you need to also buy in other supporters, or explain it, for example, to other verifying organizational functions like audit, or like compliance, or like ACS, or whatever, internal advisors, internal consultants, to demonstrate, okay, that's actually the stake we're having, that's the idea we're having, and we would like to buy you in, because you also could use our result to combine it into your results, and then we can grow together. And fourth point, it's quite simple. Communicate. Make it transparent and demonstrate and communicate it. Display what you're doing and display what the outcome is. Because when it's clear what the outcome is and the result, then it's also clear what the benefit is. And the more transparent you are, the more the more it's understandable what you're doing, the easier your criteria is understanding, and the grading is, the easier the people can follow you. Last point is to improve, and that's actually coming back to this ITIL circle, to think about. You've learned from your methodology, you've learned about performing the first assessments, you felt, you stood up, you did something. So try it out. And when you try it out and you learned something went wrong, change it. And when you change it, go back again and communicate again. So make it clear and transparent that you have revised your own methodology. And that's actually the last kind of ideas I would like to give you in your hands for a Friday afternoon to first think and then act. And yes, and I invite you and hope some questions come up. And unfortunately, we're not having possibility to having a cup of coffee or beer later. But in case you need some contact, please get back to me.
Thank you, Frank. Well, first think, then act is always a good idea. May I ask the room, are there any questions? Ja, bitte. Okay, sure, of course.
Thanks for your talk. I have a question regarding a specific characteristic in security. We have, as a defender, we have to close every way for attacker to get in. But he needs only one way to get in. So we have many security measures that have more like an on-off characteristic in terms of effectiveness. Your firewall with one hole is ineffective completely. I've seen in your slide where you map focus areas to your maturity model that some lower rated focus areas are still creating a pretty mature result. So my question is, what's your approach to keep yourself in this process from, to call it greenwashing, those flipped characteristic measures? That would be really interesting.
Okay, greenwashing and signalizing green in a report is actually not my intention. What we did, and this is I couldn't disclose, is what we are doing is we are firstly verifying the design on or demonstrating the design effectiveness on a solution. And let's assume you have one policy requirement, like firewall rules should be verified at least once a year. That's a quite typical requirement you might have in your policy. So then the first type or start in the assessment is to verify, okay, how did operations pick up this requirement and implemented it correctly? And did they have, for example, controls over that? So that, for example, the firewall rules are not or are really verified at least once a year. They might alter, they might be disconnected if they're not removed or something, if they're not reviewed, so that there's something in design. And when a design fails or it's not working, then you can forget about the operational effectiveness. And that's something what our methodology also considers. That's number one. Number two is, in case the design describes it correctly, then we deep dive into if it's really done. Like, do we have proof on, let's say, samples of 20, samples of 30, if firewall rules were reviewed once a year according to what the policy says? And this gives absolutely the link between what does the standard, the ivory tower wants, and what does actually the real implementation do. And this, I think, gives a good signal on if it's working or not. And let's assume you have a sample of 10 and 1 out of 10 is not working or was not reviewed, then it's not automatically effective. It can be lower already. Does this answer your question?
Thank you. Are there any other questions? So Frank, one from me. Well, maturity is, in my opinion, an integrated part of standards like ISO 27001 or NIST. So the need for continuous improvement is absolutely necessary for each and every company. And do you use some standards? Are you satisfied with the Börse?
We are currently implementing COBIT, but COBIT focuses only on IT, sadly. This means we could not directly cope it and merge it into all the, let's say, requirements on maturity for information security. And this is why I developed this kind of twist of ITIL and twist of CMMI into that direction.
So it's a great idea because I totally agree, it's absolutely necessary. Thank you very much, Frank. If there are not any more questions, we are going to a little coffee break and pick up with the next talk at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.